Hi, thanks for tuning in. This is the US Futures Weekly Chart Analysis for the week ending 16th of May 2025. First chart is the US Dollar Index Futures. As usual, you can see that this market moved higher this week and importantly back above the lows of the longer term trading range. This is the longer term trading range in here. The market's been trading in this zone for quite a while now. This level above is an area between two zones. The next zone above that is up here. And there's expected to be reduced supply within this level between the two. The market moved higher this week after a little period of consolidation in here and absorption. Price moved into the zone again, although it did close well off its high, which suggests that some supply is being drawn out. And because of that, I expect you'll almost certainly see a test for supply early this week coming up. The market will pull back slightly and just see how much supply is in the market. But that was a pretty good effort to push back into the zone above. It looked like it was going to do that, and we suggested that last week. The trick now will be to maintain its position back at that level, and we'll just see how it goes or whether it's rejected. E-mini S&P. This is S&P 500 index futures, and in response to last week's consolidation and testing for supply, right up high in this bar's range, and you'll note that it was adjacent to this congestion to the left. The market's accelerated higher this week. That's a pretty good move. It was kind of what we expected to see. Now you've got this older congestion up here now to contend with, and I expect that the market will have to spend some time absorbing supply if it moves up to that level. I won't be surprised to see, similar to the previous chart and this previous bar down here, a little test for supply next week, at least early. That'll offer the market some chance to consolidate and absorb any supply that's drawn out before there's a more serious attempt to push higher. US Treasury 10-year note futures. They came back again this week. Firstly, you'll note that all the trading more recently has been within the range of this bar. This is the high volume down bar. Look at the very high volume on this. And the market's being controlled by that bar to some extent. There's an attempt to recover here, and all the trading's been within that bar's range for some time now. This week, price moved back, but then recovered and closed well off the week's low, albeit on relatively low volume. So while activity was low in this market, there was some buying support drawn out, and that's enabled the close to be a little above mid-bar. And you'll note that even this bar here, the market's trading mostly inside of that bar's range more recently as well. So you've got a market here that's kind of bound up at the moment, and we'll just look for a breakout either way before the market really starts to trend again. Copper price futures. Copper price futures are trading sideways within the range of this bar for the most part at the moment. Last week was a consolidation bar with the market closing right in the middle of that week's traded range. This week the market's traded inside that bar's range as well, with a reduced spread on reduced volume. There is not much intent going on here. What you're seeing is consolidation. And we'll look for this market to show some intent before it starts to trend again. Gold price futures. Gold price futures traded lower this week in response to the supply that we saw drawn out last week. We've had weakness here, and the market came back in response, although there was an attempt to support the market almost immediately, and that saw price push higher last week. But we noted that the close well off the week's high suggested that some supply was drawn out and the market would likely come back and test for supply at the very least. And it did come back. It did draw out supply. The volume was quite high this week, and that saw price pull back a little more deeply than just a test for supply. But it has recovered somewhat, and it closed adjacent to this down bar's low here. So the market did see some moderate buying support emerge, and this market is saying it doesn't really want to break down. You've got some levels below down here where the market would move to and test for strength if there really was weakness in the market. But it appears that there's an attempt to support the market despite the supply that's been drawn out on these two bars previously. I'm expecting this market to attempt to consolidate sideways in response. It may even try to go up again like it did on this bar. And then if it does, we'll just note how much supply appears to be drawn out. You'll see that on the position of the close and how wide the spread is. Silver price futures. Silver price futures traded just sideways this week with no real intent whatsoever. Spread was relatively narrow. Volume was well below the average. This was the market marking time, probably waiting for gold to show some intent before this market could follow. But this week at least, this market traded sideways just above the highs of the range with a narrow spread showing little intent. Like crude price futures did move higher this week, which to some extent confirms the buying that was seen down here. We noted this bar closed well off its low on an increase in volume and above average volume. The next bar tested below that bar's low here and rejected going lower and moved higher in response. And that's in some ways confirming the buying support that was seen in the previous bar. And that was then confirmed this week by this week's bar being higher, albeit with a reduced spread on an increase in volume. So there is still supply being drawn out, and the market probably is still vulnerable, but there's a noticeable attempt to support this market. And we'll just see which side ends up gaining the upper hand, whether it be the buyers or the sellers. There's quite a battle going on right now, and one side will eventually come out on top. But at the moment, the battle continues between supply and demand. Onto the currencies now. This is the euro-US dollar currency pair. You can see the market's been moving higher more recently in a pretty logical sort of way. The weakness continues here, and that's reflecting the strength in the US dollar at the moment. This market trades very close to the inverse of the US dollar, with only some fundamentals locally in the Eurozone playing its part in the market. And just how the US dollar closed a little off its highs, this market closed a little off its low this week, which suggests that some buying support did emerge, although volume suggests that it wasn't particularly strong. I would expect this market will attempt to move higher next week, albeit I don't expect it's going to stretch high with any great amount of spread. I think it will just float a little higher on relatively low volume. British pound currency futures, similar to the euro in some respects. And this week, price did move lower, but this market closed well off its low on still below average volume, reduced and below average volume, but it did close quite positively up near the week's high. This market is perhaps a little stronger than the euro, and I expect this market may attempt to move higher in response next week. It will also depend on how the US dollar is trading, obviously. but I would expect there's a tendency for this market to make an attempt to move higher if the opportunity was presented. Japanese yen currency futures, and they also came back and recovered quite strongly, closing well off the week's low and right up near the week's high. This market's pulled back from the adjacent highs to the left over here, where we saw supply drawn out on this bar. And the market's come back and it's actually consolidating in here. You see these two bars have closed pretty much level. Their lows are almost level. The market's dipped lower in shakeout sort of fashion and rejected moving lower and closed back up near the week's high. So this is buying support come in. Activity was a little low still, reduced and below the average, but there's been an attempt to support the market, and the market's attempting to consolidate sideways in here. We'll see how that continues next week. Aussie dollar currency futures. I was expecting they would pull back somewhat and trade in here, but they've rejected moving lower. We've noticed the last 2 weeks have seen price attempt to push higher and then fade down, and then attempt to push higher and then fade down. This is often seen when the market's attempting to accumulate or consolidate and not move lower. We're adjacent to this 64-cent level, and it does appear that this market is attempting to consolidate adjacent to that level and not move down into the 62, 63 cent level. We'll see how that goes next week. If the US dollar does pull back a little bit from the lows of the trading range it's just moved into, this market may float a little higher in here. The next level comes through there, the level above through there. So it may be that this market does attempt to consolidate in here and may even push up into this level if the US dollar did see some weakness emerge. So it's one worth watching for sure. Bitcoin futures. Bitcoin futures did move into consolidation mode this week, which is what we expected. Put some lines in quickly. This is where the market was consolidating back here before it accelerated higher. It pushed up, and after a week's consolidation, it moved up to the highs of the range where supply was drawn out, and we noted it at the time. The lows were coming through here, and that supply eventually won out and pushed price lower. The market then spent some time in consolidation mode at this level, and you'll see just more recently prices accelerated higher. 1 week's consolidation again, a push up to the highs of the range, and this week another week of consolidation, which is exactly what's expected. This is an important level. Supply was drawn out at this level previously. We saw it up here on the very high volume that was drawn out. There's high volumes are down here. So it would make good sense for this market to consolidate up at this level here, absorb supply, and then make an attempt to push higher once the selling pressure is low. Now, volume was reduced and below average again this week, so that does suggest that selling pressure is low, and that opens the door for an attempt to push higher if trading conditions are favourable. So look for that this week. You may see the market just test for supply early, or maybe just over the weekend with a relatively narrow spread. And then if supply continues to be low, there may be an attempt to push higher later next week. We'll watch this one closely. Just back to the US dollar index futures quickly. Now that we've seen all the other charts, this one makes quite a bit of sense. Here's the lows of the range through here. The market's pushed up and into that level after a little bit of consolidation has taken place in the previous 4 weeks. The market did close off the highs for the week. So some supply was being drawn out here. Volume was just a little below the average, so it wasn't overwhelming supply. This market's at an important juncture now. It'll either reject this level and break back below the lows of the range, and a push below that level would be significant. You probably won't see that all in 1 week. You'll see the market move lower, attempt to consolidate, and then there would be a breakdown in response. Or you'll see this market move sideways and retain a position above the lows of the range. And that would be a relative sign of strength. So it's going to be interesting for the next few weeks to see if this market can hold on or whether it does fade lower. It's certainly at an important juncture and one worth watching. Okay, thanks for your time. We'll see you again next week. Thank you. See ya.